is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Welcome to my program, The Bridge, a monthly show bridging different cultures, communities, and faith traditions. Watch The Bridge on America's Voice of the Arabs Network on all social media platforms. Welcome to all our listeners and viewers. It's another great episode of The Bridge on US Arab Radio and also live streaming on Facebook. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, and we're talking today about freedom of expression in the United States and around the world in 2022 and beyond. And with me this morning discussing this important and timely topic are two experts in this area, Ms. Summer Lopez, who is the Chief Program Officer for Free Expression at PEN America, and Ms. Mehta, who is the Senior Editor at Harvard Public Health Magazine, and also the lead researcher on PEN America's latest report on hate in the headlines. Welcome to the show, ladies, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Sahar.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to have you both on the show. Let's start, Summer, by giving our listeners and viewers a brief idea about PEN America. What is PEN America? What is the mission and vision of this important organization?
Absolutely. Thank you, Sahar, again for having us. So PEN America we're actually celebrating our 100th anniversary this year. So we're a 100-year-old organization that operates at the intersection of literature and human rights to celebrate the written word and writers and to defend freedom of expression and creative freedom in the US and globally. And we're part of a global network of PEN centers around the world that do this work in over 100 different countries. And this has really been essentially our core mission for this century that we have been around. We're an organization of writers, a membership organization with members around the country, around the US, and we work on behalf of writers to defend the freedom to write, to defend the liberties that make writing and creative expression possible. And so a lot of our advocacy is looking at cases of writers and artists and journalists under threat around the world for their work, but also defending the principles of freedom of expression here in the US and globally.
Very interesting, and congratulations on the 100th anniversary.
Thank you.
It's really a very important milestone. I didn't know PEN America has been around for that long, but it's awesome to know that you guys have a century long of history in this important field and this important area. And it's also important to know that it's not just restricted to the United States. It's also about freedom of expression broadly and globally around the world. And it's not just freedom of the press, but freedom of expression in terms of writing and scholarly work and contributions, not just journalism, which is really amazing and very, very important. Building off on this particular point, Summer, I wonder if we can possibly give our listeners and viewers a brief idea about some of the most important threats that are really threatening freedom of expression internationally and globally at the moment.
Sure. I mean, I think internationally, a big part of what we're just seeing generally is sort of a resurgence of authoritarianism around the country and increasing restrictions on a number of freedoms in a lot of countries and quite a bit of democratic backsliding in a lot of different regions as well. And so I think all of that is resounding to increased restrictions and oppression targeting writers, artists, journalists, activists kind of across the board, right? And we've also, I think, obviously just kind of come off of a year of a tremendous amount of instability. We've seen, the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the impact that that has had around the world. And I think that we have, of course, the CPJ report just came out about a record number of journalists imprisoned. We also put out a Freedom to Write Index every year that counts the number of writers imprisoned around the world. That has also, that was released in April of this year, looking back at 2021, also saw the largest number of writers imprisoned around the world. And a lot of that is in places where we've seen pretty significant, backsliding or regression in terms of democratic progress recently, places like Myanmar, even places like India that end up on our pretty high numbers on our index. So I think that sort of broad environment that we're operating in also is affecting us here in the United States and in democracies too, right? Where we're seeing kind of more willingness to silence speech or restrict speech, and even to use the levers of government. So, I mean, a lot of what we've been very focused on this year in the US is looking at legislation that has been introduced around the country to restrict what issues and topics can be talked about in classrooms, both at the K through 12 and university and college level. So we've termed those educational gag orders, and that is something, we've seen really proliferate around the country over the past year. At the same time, we've also seen a spate of efforts to ban books in schools and school libraries around the country as well, at a pretty unprecedented level from anything in kind of recent memory. So, I think we're seeing a lot of kind of increased willingness to place restrictions on ideas, on access to literature and learning, and place restrictions on the educational space, in particular in the US right now. That's very concerning.
And really, the word authoritarianism caught my attention because that's what I'm doing a lot of my research on at the moment. Like, 11 years ago in 2011, as you all know, we had this, techno-euphoric moment, the moment of euphoria about social media and new media and what they can do in terms of paving the way for democracy and freedom and, reform and so on. And now, fast forward 11 years later, we're writing about digital authoritarianism and how regimes are pretty much clamping down on freedom of the press and freedom of expression in so many different ways, using the very same tools of the internet and social media and new media. And Christine, would you like to add something also related to some of these very important and prevalent threats at the moment?
I would say that in addition, what's been interesting to observe is that this is obviously a pattern that's been going on for quite a while, particularly in democratic countries, which is something I've been looking at for the better part of 8 years. So even as early as 2012, 2013, 2014, we saw crackdowns on civil society beginning to happen, which is obviously an outgrowth of growing autocratic control to try and limit freedom of expression and civil society activity in places like India, where I was based at the time. In general, I would also say that we've been seeing a growth of propaganda and specifically partisan media, if we're talking specifically about the journalism and media landscape, that reject journalistic norms, which is a growing problem around the world. I recently saw Reporters Without Borders review of 2022 that called this growth of partisan media and propaganda as a growth of the Fox News model. So I think this is something that we're seeing, particularly in democratic countries, where polarization, both not only of the electorate, but also of the media landscape.
If I can add, I think in terms of the sort of abuse of some of these tools, I think another big trend of the past year or two has been the degree to which surveillance is being utilized against journalists and writers and activists by authoritarian countries, including beyond those countries' borders, right, and inside freer democratic societies as well. And so I think that's also a kind of alarming theme over the past year has been the sense that even those who may be living in exile or who may, find themselves in a freer country still feel that there are limitations on what they can say if they, for example, have family still at home in an authoritarian country or simply don't feel completely safe, because we've seen instances of countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran and Russia and China reach beyond their borders to try and silence people and intimidate people into silence as well.
Absolutely. It's a very unfortunate and very alarming process now called transnational repression.
Yeah.
And so this transnational repression basically means that, exactly like you just said now, Summer, that it's not, basically safe for anyone, even those who are in the diaspora and abroad when they are opponents, and they're very vocal and outspoken against their own regimes. They're not free or safe from governmental retaliation and repression, which is a very alarming process. And also the role of social media in this, I would really like to maybe give a little bit of emphasis here, because as I said earlier, we're looking at social media as tools for liberation. And now in so many ways, we are seeing them changing into tools of repression. So maybe both of you would like to maybe, highlight this a little bit or talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, I'm happy to say something. I think I've had quite a few conversations over the past month or two about Twitter, obviously. And I think a lot of the themes of those have been that even though everybody agrees that, Twitter was a pretty miserable place in some ways, and there are many things very wrong with it, it has also nonetheless continued to be a really vital place for information sharing and for holding public figures accountable and for organizing and communication around the globe. And, I think that is at real danger of being lost right now, of course. And it's been quite clear to me that Elon Musk is not concerned about that aspect of it at all. But, the value of social media, I do think still exists. And to many people, it is still a lifeline in terms of being one of the few options they have for freedom of expression and for access to information in closed enclosed societies. And so I think, that has to remain part of this conversation. And we can't kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of solving the problems of social media, forgetting the opportunities that it does in fact offer, and thinking about how we can solve some of those challenges without being counterproductive. And that's something, at PEN America, we have long had a focus, for example, on online abuse and the effect that online abuse has on freedom of expression. It is something that silences people, and disinformation as well. Disinformation can be a problem for freedom of expression. It makes it harder to have open and credible discourse. But the solution to those, can't simply be to kind of shut down the online speech or shut down the online space in ways that will inevitably kind of backfire or create less space for dialogue. So, I think that's a little bit of the moment that we're in right now, which, I hope we'll be able to find a way through without losing some of the benefits of what Twitter and other social media platforms have offered. But I think that the challenges of reckoning with the very real harms that can happen in online spaces, with protecting them as spaces for freedom of expression, is one of our great challenges, for sure.
And it's becoming very clear that social media is really a double-edged sword, right? You have all of these benefits of getting information out to a very large number of people, very, very quickly, to a very broad base. But at the same time, you also have so many threats related to misinformation and disinformation and hate speech and other things that up till this moment, we don't really have a cure or, some kind of solution for many of these issues and many of these threats. Christine, would you like to, share your insights on this point as well, please?
I would just say that social media as a tool, I agree with everything that Summer said, but unfortunately, any tool can be co-opted by nefarious actors, whether they're state or non-state. And so one of the things I know that PEN America has worked on quite a bit, specifically when it comes to the traditional media landscape, is talking about the importance of investing in public infrastructure, public media. And I think that a lot of the safety and guardrails that we talk about that are lacking in social media spaces that allow them to be flooded with disinformation and actors with intentions of eroding democratic norms and democratic spaces for civil society conversation is that they are ultimately private platforms with incentives that don't necessarily align it with the public interest. So at the end of the day, social media companies are incentivized to encourage outrage, encourage clickbait, encourage polemic rather than meaningful discourse. So all of these points have been made by many others who have much more expertise than I do in these areas. But I think this is something that we really need to grapple with when we talk about the social media space, is that these are ultimately private platforms with their own agendas to fulfill from a commercial basis, much like the traditional media landscape. So when we talk about a reckoning with social media and how public discourse should be carried out in those spaces, not only do we need to talk about safety, guardrails, norms around speech on those platforms, but we also do need to talk about what are the incentives driving those platforms and how it affects our discourse and the public interest.
Absolutely. And now there is a lot of research that also shows that social media, unfortunately, is an agent or a factor that increases exactly what you just mentioned now, Christine, fragmentation, polarization, and division, rather than bringing people to a sensible middle ground of constructive and positive dialogue. People are pretty much living in their own echo chambers, and very, very few people are willing to step outside of their own comfort zone to meet others who may be different from their own position or their own perspective. We'll come back to this very interesting and important discussion right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
Caroling parties.
Who wants to spin the dreidel?
I do, Grandpa.
Holiday celebrations.
We're missing a sugar plum fairy. Has anyone seen Amelia?
School pageants.
This is the best lemon bar I've ever tasted. I need this recipe.
Cookie exchanges.
No way! A pet hamster? He's so cute!
Gift giving. Let's savor every moment of togetherness this season. Keep the holiday cheer going by keeping your COVID-19 and flu vaccines up to date. Help protect yourself and others so we can all have a healthy and happy holiday season. Learn more at michigan.gov/COVID vaccine. A message from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services.
At Top Rehab Physical Therapy Clinic in Dearborn, we provide effective physical therapy sessions in order to limit pain and discomfort. Top Rehab provides physical therapy care for any diagnosis prescribed by a physician, and we regularly see and treat conditions such as stroke, TMJ, fibromyalgia, sciatica, joint pain, and more. We use a variety of pain management methods, including modalities, soft tissue mobilization, and therapeutic exercise. If you're in need of physical rehabilitation or physical therapy, get the highest quality health care at Top Rehab. Most insurance is accepted, and we're open Monday, Wednesday, and Friday 8 to 6, Tuesday and Thursday 8 to 5, and Saturday 10 till 2. Call for an appointment today at 313-846-0555. That's 313-846-0555. Choose Top Rehab Physical Therapy Clinic on Michigan Avenue in Dearborn. Life's too short to be in pain.
Ziyad brand. Quality products from our family to yours. Ziyad Brothers Importing offers the finest quality products, including brands like Sultan, Kraft, Nestle, Hook, Rico Picon, Dana, and many more. Ask your retailer to carry these fine products because you deserve the very best. For more information, visit our website at www.ziyad.com. That's www.ziyad.com. Ziyad, quality products from our family to yours.
Are your hands feeling numb? Do you feel pain opening up a jar, turning a key? Are you noticing that your elbow and your shoulder are becoming stiff? Or were you recently injured in your arm? Hello, I'm Dr. Albanjit Katranji, and at the Katranji Hand Center, which just recently opened down the street from the Somerset Mall, we can provide you with the latest in hand, wrist, elbow, and shoulder care. Visit us at www.katranjihandcenter.com to learn the latest techniques that we have to offer you, and I look forward to taking care of you.
Visit us in Troy at 1565 West Big Beaver Road, Building F, or call Katranji Hand Center for an appointment at 248-869-4263. That's 248-869-4263.
This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Welcome to my program, The Bridge, a monthly show bridging different cultures, communities, and faith traditions. Watch The Bridge on America's Voice of the Arabs Network on all social media platforms.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, and we're talking today about a very important and timely topic: the threats to freedom of expression in 2022 and beyond. And with me this morning discussing this important and timely topic are Ms. Summer Lopez, the Chief Program Officer for Free Expression at PEN America, and Ms. Christine Mehta, the Senior Editor at Harvard Public Health Magazine and the lead researcher on PEN America's latest report on hate in the headlines. If we were to give a very close look and zoom in specifically on the year 2022, it has been full of so many different events. You know, we had the Ukraine war, the protests in Iran, so many different things have been going on. Summer, if we start with you, please give us some kind of overview on some of the most important impacts that all of that has had on freedom of expression in some of the countries and regions all over the world, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a very destabilizing year in a lot of ways, right? I mean, obviously, we're also in sort of the third year of the pandemic and still kind of wrestling with some of the implications of that, which there have been significant freedom of expression implications from a lot of that as well. But I think, the war in Ukraine is obviously kind of the dominant factor this year. And I think, there's both sort of the practical effects of that, the targeting of journalists, the arrests and killing of journalists in Ukraine and in occupied areas of Ukraine by Russian authorities. There's been a tremendous amount of targeting of Ukrainian culture. PEN America just put out a report on this a couple of weeks ago. It was actually launched in partnership with our colleagues at PEN Ukraine and with a delegation of writers and our CEO and COO who traveled to Ukraine to launch this report, documenting the ways in which the Russian government has specifically made a part of their goal the destruction and elimination of Ukrainian culture as a distinct culture and targeting of the Ukrainian language, of books and teaching in Ukrainian in occupied areas, and the hitting of cultural sites across the country in ways that are hard to distinguish from the kind of just indiscriminate bombing that has occurred, but seem to be so widespread that they don't seem very random either. The hitting of cultural community cultural centers, museums, artwork across the board, and the impact that this has had on writers and the cultural community in Ukraine. I think there's also just the broader question of the sort of severe violation of international norms that this represents, right? And what that means for sort of the international order and what that means for protection of rights around the world. And so I think this is, it's hard to understate the implications of this, certainly for Ukraine and for the region, but also for people around the world. And we've also, of course, seen, as you mentioned, the protests in Iran, which to some extent I think are a sign of I take such inspiration and hope and admiration from the courage of Iranian women and Iranians of all stripes who have taken to the streets. But the crackdown has been so severe and so concerning. And again, we have seen, so many journalists targeted, many writers, many artists targeted as well. And this is something, honestly, it's a theme that we have seen in recent years around the world. We've seen a lot of cases in which protest movements in Belarus, in Myanmar, around the globe have had writers and artists really at the forefront, and rappers and graffiti artists really, engaging in very public acts of resistance through their art and being targeted for that. And we've seen, severe crackdowns against those communities in a number of different countries. And it feels quite clear that Iran is the most recent example of that, but it's very distressing. And so I think that this is also just a broader trend that is very concerning and really highlights, I think, for us, why it's important to think about writers and artists as a category of people who are targeted in similar ways to what we see often targeting journalists, for their power, for their ability to rally the public and call power to account, and inspire people, and that makes them targets. And we are definitely seeing that in a lot of these different countries. Another region I would just highlight, I think, because it often doesn't get talked about a lot, but we've obviously seen a tremendous crackdown on journalists in Latin America over the past year or two, and the number of murders of journalists in Mexico over this year has just been horrifying. And I think, we are seeing, again, this sort of a sense of kind of a breakdown of norms and the degree to which people are particularly vulnerable in this moment if they are putting themselves out there in terms of trying to hold the powerful to account, to do accountability reporting, to be expressing themselves in ways that are contrary to the interests of the status quo and those in power. So I think just in general, we're seeing a lot of concerning trends in a lot of different places. Myanmar continues to be of concern for us as well. Again, also not getting as much attention these days, but still a very alarming situation there as well.
And of course, the Arab world, the Middle East is no exception. We also see a lot of surge in terms of arrests of journalists, activists, regimes opponents, those who are outspoken and vocal. They face all sorts of frightening consequences, arrests and imprisonments and retaliation of all different forms. Christine, you would like to add something, please, to this discussion?
I would just second that. I think that we're seeing illiberal or democracies that trend towards illiberalism reaching new heights in terms of how bold they are willing to go, or how bold they're willing to be in arresting journalists and writers and artists and activists. I'll just give a very brief example. India, for example, has arrested, I think, up to 10 different Kashmiri journalists over the past year and imprisoned them under a very old national security law called the Public Safety Act, which Amnesty International has done a lot of work on over the years. But we've seen the Indian government, and other illiberal democracies use these particular tactics to try and chill freedom of the press, try to suppress reporting, especially in disputed territories or issues that sort of counter the national line or government line, et cetera. But I would say that all the time that I've been monitoring some of these regions, I am seeing a new boldness in law enforcement and government willing to continually and repeatedly jail these actors in a way that they hadn't 5 to 10 years ago. And I think that because in 2022, we are seeing less and less accountability in some of these places because of just rising authoritarianism around the world and sort of a vacuum in global leadership in holding some of these governments to account for this sort of behavior. So activists, I think, are screaming louder and louder in these places, but we're just seeing some of these national security laws and other sort of legal tools being weaponized against activists and journalists in a way that I don't think we've seen in a very long time.
Absolutely. It's a very scary picture. And I think, Summer, you mentioned earlier also COVID-19. And that's a very important point because actually in the midst of COVID-19, there has been a very big crackdown on freedom of the press and freedom of expression more broadly because some regimes started to use certain apps, under the disguise of protecting, public health and, trying to protect people's health and public health and saying, giving you these apps for contact tracing. But in fact, it's been much more than that. It's been also tracing of the regime's opponents and journalists and so on. So would you like maybe to comment a little bit on the impact that COVID-19 has had on freedom of expression and freedom of the press, globally and internationally?
Yes, I mean, I think there's both the sort of surveillance element. There's also been, I think also under sort of the guise of protecting public health, more of a crackdown on disinformation when they actually mean critiques of the government. So, we've seen quite a few countries pass anti-disinformation laws over the past year that have been, of course, utilized quickly against journalists and activists. And, I think also, again, just sort of the kind of shifting norms in terms of government being able to have more control over people's movement, over people's expression, and the fact that while there were obviously restrictions that were necessary in sort of the throes of the pandemic and things that did need to be done for a public health perspective, a lot of regimes were very happy to take advantage of that as an opportunity to go further and to put new restrictions in place. And I think that and the sort of the cover that has provided for going after more people under the premise of them promoting disinformation or something like that has definitely been something that I think we've seen across the board as well.
Absolutely. And even the fighting misinformation laws in many of these countries were deliberately left vague, ambiguous, and very broad in order to give this kind of, leverage for the regimes, if you will, to really kind of crack down on opponents under the guise or under the mantle of protecting, society from disinformation, when in fact it's like silencing all of these oppositional voices. Christine, you want to add something about also the impact that COVID-19 has had globally, internationally on different countries, different regions, on freedom of the expression, not just freedom of the press, but freedom of expression more broadly?
I think Summer's covered it really thoroughly. This is something we've been seeing happen since 2020, and organizations based all around the world have been sort of screaming about lockdowns and pointing out the restrictions on movement, increased surveillance, and fears, I think, really that a new norm is being established in certain countries that have realized that this type of surveillance can now be normalized. So I think we are entering a new era in which civil society actors writ large will need to renew their diligence around protecting themselves, protecting their data. We'll need to invest as a global community and the international NGO community in making sure that we're allocating resources and energy into protecting frontline defenders, whether they're writers, artists, human rights defenders, or journalists.
Yes, indeed, I totally agree. I mean, one line, has really run through this entire discussion or conversation has been social media, right? How it's being used by activists and writers and journalists, but also how it's been abused and misused and manipulated by regimes and by those in power. And one question I always get asked, that unfortunately I don't have an answer for, quite frankly, is how can we possibly avoid some of these dangers and some of these threats, right? I wish I had an answer to this multi-million-dollar question, but I don't. But, Summer, is that something that PEN America has looked at, the issue, for example, of quote unquote internet regulation or putting some kinds of maybe laws or certain regulations in place to try to avoid some of these negative effects and implications we have been talking about all along?
Yeah, you are right. It is the multi-million-dollar question because there are definitely no straightforward answers. And obviously, as a freedom of expression organization, we are wary of a lot of potential solutions that could end up, either just directly constricting the space for online speech, or could be abused and manipulated to, deliberately constrict space and limit speech. And so, it is very challenging, I think, to think about regulatory or legislative solutions. I think a lot of the focus has shifted to be more about increasing transparency and regulating increased transparency from the platforms so that at least the public and legislators have a better understanding of what is actually happening, how decisions are being made, how algorithms are being designed, because I think the issue often on social media isn't really about the speech that is being expressed itself. What's really the problem is what is being amplified and how is that being fed to people, and what is being incentivized to be amplified. And so, I think better understanding of those systems and more ability to hold those systems to account versus the sort of content itself. We certainly, are very wary of any sort of content regulation or further liability for the platforms in relation to content, because that can incentivize them to really shut things down. But better understanding the systems, better adherence to some kind of basic principles. I mean, there's the Santa Clara principles, or a set of principles were really set out some years ago by civil society to ask the platforms to, think about human rights-based approaches to management of data and content. And, there's been some progress toward that, but it's been insufficient. And, in the case of Twitter, we've basically seen whatever progress had been made has just been wiped out in the past month. And so, I think, I feel like watching Elon Musk be in charge of Twitter has been a reminder that as bad as things were, they could be worse. And now it is worse, right? Now we're seeing what happens when it's literally just one person's whim to make up a rule because somebody's post irritated him personally, right? I mean, the whole idea here is that you would have clear, principled guidelines for decision-making and clear policies from the platforms that people understand and can adhere to, and that if they feel, they've been punished for violating them in error, that they have some recourse, that there are clear and transparent systems in place, and also that the public and the researchers in particular have the ability to understand how these things are working and to study them, because that's the other real challenge is the platforms are so opaque with their data and their information that we can't even really understand what's happening in terms of disinformation or what would work to counter it or some of the harms that are happening on the platform. So without that transparency and the ability for outside researchers to really do that work, it's very hard to figure out what the solutions actually are that could be that could address some of the harms, but also maintain a space for online speech.
Absolutely. I cannot agree more. We're going to come back to this interesting and lively discussion right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
What's my ETA?
Your estimated time of arrival is 9:17.
I'm late. I'll have to punch it.
Speeding will save you just 1 minute and 36 seconds. It will also increase your risk of a crash, as well as the odds that you will be stopped and issued an expensive speeding ticket.
Yeah, but...
In 1 year, there were 22,000 speeding-related crashes in Michigan, resulting in 200 deaths.
If I had someone in the car with me, I'd drive slower. But it's just me.
This is not a logical response. Though you have no passenger, surrounding cars contain 27 others, including 5 children and 1 Labrador Retriever.
How do you know all this stuff?
I know everything, Kevin.
Your risk of a crash increases with every mile you drive over the speed limit. So slow down. Speed enforcement is happening now. A message from the Michigan Office of Highway Safety Planning.
Enjoy the first Syrian-style cuisine in Michigan. At Damas Cuisine and Catering, you'll find a wide selection of Syrian foods and sweets in our menu, like frike, poisi, grape leaves with steak, mashawi platter, hot mahashi, char-grilled kebab, shawarma, and much more. Get super fast delivery from Damas Cuisine and Catering right to your door. Order online at damascuisine.com/menu and track your order live. Damas Cuisine and Catering, 28841 Orchard Lake Road in Farmington Hills. Call 248-987-4985. Life is a nonprofit charity that's provided humanitarian aid and development to people and communities for over 25 years, regardless of race, color, religion, or cultural background. When disaster occurs here or around the world, Life for Relief and Development rushes in to provide food, medical aid, and shelter to those in need. Please help improve these efforts. Make your tax-deductible donation to Life now at lifeusa.org or call 248-424-7493. Get ready for an amazing experience at Ishtar Restaurant on 15 Mile Road in Sterling Heights. Enjoy excellent hospitality from owners Ali Al-Baghdadi and Fatty Bonham, serving the best in Mediterranean food. Try Chef Ali Al-Baghdadi's famous shawarma, the best Iraqi grills and food, and the best Arabic and international dishes. Dine in our authentic atmosphere or take out. Call 586-698-2585 or check us out on Facebook. Ishtar Restaurant practices all CDC guidelines and is open every day 11 a.m. to 10 p.m. Have an amazing experience today at Ishtar Restaurant, 3625 15 Mile Road, Sterling Heights.
This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Welcome to my program, The Bridge, a monthly show bridging different cultures, communities, and faith traditions. Watch The Bridge on America's Voice of the Arabs Network on all social media platforms.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis. We're talking today about a very important and lively topic, threats to freedom of expression in 2022 and beyond. And with me this morning discussing this important and lively topic are Ms. Summer Lopez, the Chief Program Officer of Free Expression at PEN America, and Ms. Christine Mehta, the Senior Editor at Harvard Public Health Magazine, and the lead researcher on PEN America's latest report on hate in the headlines. Hate in the headlines. What a title, what a name for a report. We know that a lot has been going on in the world recently. We have seen the rise in hate speech. We have seen the rise in movements like QAnon and Alex Jones and others who have been spreading, misinformation and disinformation, and also the rise, of course, of the far right. I really want to get some, insight from you, Summer, on some of the reasons and some of the motivations behind the decision of PEN America to really kind of have this very, very important report.
Yes, thank you. Well, I think part of what we kind of thought about when we were thinking about the origins of this report was this question of, coverage of the increasing influence of the far right and extremism in our politics, and how this had been covered by journalists sort of during the Trump era and sort of as Trump kind of came to prominence, and then during the administration, and how we kind of got to the point, I think, where for a lot of journalists and commentators, January 6th kind of came as a surprise, and maybe it shouldn't have. And I think that was part of what our thinking was, trying to get an understanding of sort of how we came to that point, and how this was, how these questions were evolving within the sphere of journalism. I think there were a lot of journalists who had reflected significantly on coverage of Trump over the years in particular. But in the post-Trump era, I think what we've seen is, it was, in some ways, it was a little bit easier to debate how you cover Donald Trump as an individual person. It's much more complicated to debate how you cover the fact that, there are hundreds of candidates in this year's midterms who deny the results of the 2020 elections, that there are people with associations with QAnon, with various extremist or conspiracy groups. How do you kind of deal with that as it infuses one of our two major political parties, as you try to do responsible political reporting? And so, I think those are really kind of fundamental questions that a lot of journalists have been wrestling with, and we kind of recognized that challenge and wanted to both better understand it and kind of understand how folks within the industry were thinking about those questions, and try to be able to offer, some sense of guidance or best practices, insights from reporters who have been covering extremism for a long time and can help, other reporters kind of think about that. But just more broadly, I think to recognize that journalism is in a really challenging moment, both in terms of the changing political landscape, the spread of disinformation, the increasing rates of online abuse and offline intimidation of journalists. At the same time as obviously we're seeing a lot of local journalism collapse and kind of the economic model fail in a lot of ways. And this is a really challenging moment for journalism at the exact same moment when our democracy is really under threat, and journalists are an absolutely key part of defending that. And so we really wanted to take, I think, a constructive approach here and think about this as a challenge that faces the industry, but how can we kind of foster more discussion about that so that the industry can think about how to approach it going forward as well.
And also, I cannot help but ask about the specific timing of releasing this particular report, Summer, because as I said, there's been a lot of parallel phenomena going on. In my opinion, it's not a coincidence, right? Like you have all of this increased polarization, fragmentation, the rise of the far right, right? The far right alt movements. You have, somebody like Alex Jones spreading conspiracy theories. You have the QAnon movement, and I can go on and on and on. So I wanted to specifically ask you about the timing, your decision to choose this particular time or timing for releasing this very important and critical report.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it is because we are seeing, this as a really essential question that journalists are reckoning with, especially in their coverage of elections, right? And in their coverage of political races, when you have, two candidates and one of them is, associated with a far right movement or really espousing extremist fringe views. How do you treat that person in, a way that is responsible as a political reporter, but also acknowledges that that's not sort of the standard, right? This is not the norm, and doesn't just kind of pretend that it is, and educates the public on that as well in a way that doesn't come across as partisan or undermine your credibility as a journalist. And so, I think these are really essential questions to be answering now, especially as we go into the 2024 election cycle, and journalists are thinking about that. I know there was a lot of reflection on the midterms as not having been as bad as expected in terms of how many election deniers were elected. A lot were not, did not win their seats, but many of them still did. And so, this problem is not going away. And I think there's a little bit of a risk of taking too much comfort from that rejection of a lot of election deniers in the midterms, but that's not necessarily the landscape that I think we're going to face going forward. So I think this is going to be an ongoing challenge for journalists and for the industry that's important to continue to think about.
Absolutely. And Christine, you were the lead researcher on this report, Hate in the Headlines. If you can give our listeners and viewers, please, a recap or an overview of some of the most important findings and results of this very important and timely report, please.
Absolutely. And I'll actually just segue a little bit from what Summer was just saying, in that domestic right-wing extremism is, even though the midterms was not quite as, quote, as bad as some people feared, many of the journalists that I interviewed warned, especially people that had been covering domestic right-wing extremism for a long time, multiple decades, and have been observing right-wing extremism for that long, had warned that right-wing extremism never goes away. That rhetoric never goes away, but it does morph in response to current events and the way that the winds change in our society. So that's something to keep in mind as we move ahead into 2023 and 2024, even though very few election deniers did actually get elected into statewide office. And we can come back to that in a few minutes. So in terms of the report, what was quite interesting is that we started out investigating how journalists, particularly between 2016 and 2018, were covering specifically organized right-wing extremism. So anti-democratic groups, hate groups, everyone that you might have seen in the headlines, Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, etc. So one thing to note about newsrooms is they are typically quite balkanized. So you have reporters and editors that typically have an expertise or are assigned to a particular beat. So you don't typically, especially in today's newsrooms, have a lot of generalists. So when it comes to covering something like domestic extremism, this, especially in 2016, when somebody like Donald Trump was elected into office, and all of a sudden we started seeing people like Stephen Miller and Stephen Bannon and all of these characters become part of our mainstream political discourse. The people who had the expertise to understand what these individuals were saying were very few and far between. This was not a mainstream or standard beat within a newsroom. So the people covering these individuals that were creeping into the political mainstream were political reporters, might have been, and now obviously we see a lot of extremist discourse around schools and school curriculum. So, in that case, education reporters, people who didn't necessarily have a background or experience in reporting on extremists and extremist groups, which requires a specific skill set. So one of the main findings that we found is that rather than focus on reporting on domestic extremist groups as a fringe phenomenon, we found that there was a significant blurring between the domestic extremism beats and political reporting specifically. So specifically, and obviously newsrooms have evolved immensely since 2016. So this is now a much more common conversation being had, but it also depends on the type of newsroom. So a lot of newsrooms that we talk to that had somebody who had expertise in domestic extremism, a lot of digital first publications like the Daily Beast or Vox or the New York Times, et cetera. These are places that have the resources to allocate specific reporters and teams to investigating these phenomena. Other newsrooms don't. And specifically when I say that, I mean local network and broadcast news. These are places that are typically very resource strapped, but it's also where a lot of Americans get their news. And so when we talk about where some of the best reporting is happening on extremism, whether it's on hate groups or the blurring of extremism into our political mainstream and discourse, it's not necessarily reaching the audience that we need it to reach. So that was really, I think, one of the most important outcomes of the report is understanding how we can start to mainstream an understanding of extremism and related, but not necessarily to be conflated as the same thing, reporting on white identity and how white identity plays a role in voting and democracy specifically. So I think to a certain degree, we're looking at trying to provide more education, allocate resources to reporters that are on existing beats within newsrooms across America, and being able to connect specialized reporting at specific outlets to other outlets that have a bigger reach to the audience that needs to be reached. I will finish up by saying this is not necessarily a laundry list. We can come back and hone in on any points that you'd like to drill down on, but I would say as another major takeaway is the role that conservative media specifically has played in providing a lens for individuals that are attempting to consume fact-based information. Conservative media captures approximately 30% of the American viewer audience. And so even if those individuals, which surveys have shown that they don't exclusively consume conservative media, and by conservative media, I mean anything from Fox News to an Alex Jones. Fox News is, at this point, operates within the right-wing media ecosystem. And I can explain that a little bit more. But these particular outlets are playing a very dangerous game in that they are providing a lens by which the American public is consuming a framework that allows them to discredit any information that comes to them from other sources that may be more fact-based. So I'll end there, but obviously there's much more to be talked about. There's, the report I think ended up at 20,000 words, so I could go on for a long time.
And is this report available for everybody to read, Christine, like it's available online? People can find it easily?
It is. I actually have it pulled up right here. It's on pen.org. So PEN America has its website. It makes all of its reports available as digital first reports for easier navigation. I assume, Summer, that's my interpretation.
Yes, that's right.
Yes. So you can go to PEN and it's accessible right from the homepage.
Right. So any of our listeners and viewers, they can just go to PEN America's website or homepage, and they can find the report easily there online.
That's right. And it's pen.org.
Pen.org. Right. Thank you so much. We'll come back to this very interesting discussion right after this commercial break. Stay tuned, please.
When you're looking for the best in optical care, Dr. Imad Nakash is your doctor to see. With years of experience and thousands of successful procedures performed, you can trust your eyes to Dr. Imad Nakash. See Dr. Imad Nakash and his professional staff for your eye care needs. There's 2 locations to serve you. In Hazel Park, call 248-336-3937. 248-336-3937. In Rochester Hills, call 248-299-3937. That's 248-299-3937.
As we continue to face COVID-19, we're now facing flu season. Influenza has the potential to infect millions, putting lives and the healthcare system at risk. Now more than ever, it's essential to protect yourself from influenza by getting the flu vaccine. The flu vaccine is safe and effective and can't give you the flu. To protect yourself and those at highest risk, get your flu vaccine. Learn more at michigan.gov/flu. A message from the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services.
Are you going to start a restaurant or grocery store soon? Do you need floor plans and designs? Call Naji Abood at 734-744-9796. Do you want to buy kitchen and restaurant equipment at discount prices? Call Naji Abood now, 734-744-9796. New Concept Products and Design, the trademark of kitchen equipment. 5% discount on all purchases of $75,000 or more. New Concept Products and Design, new location, 31185 Schoolcraft in Livonia. Learn more at www.newconceptproducts.com. Call Naji Abood, 734-744-9796.
Kashat's Mediterranean Market in Shish Kebab offers a great array of your favorite Mediterranean meals. Meals range from lamb specialties, shawarma sandwiches, and seafood dinners. Plus, they offer big trays of your favorite food and so much more. Kashat's Mediterranean Market in Shish Kebab is located at 32839 Northwestern Highway in Farmington Hills and is open from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. So stop in or call Kashat's today at 248-538-9552. That number again, 248-538-9552. Kashat's Mediterranean Market in Shish Kebab will definitely leave you satisfied.
This is Dr. Sahar Khamis. Welcome to my program, The Bridge, a monthly show bridging different cultures, communities, and faith traditions. Watch The Bridge on America's Voice of the Arabs Network on all social media platforms.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. This is your host, Dr. Sahar Khamis, and we're talking today about a very important and timely topic: threats to freedom of expression in 2022 and beyond. And with me this morning discussing this important topic are Ms. Summer Lopez, the Chief Program Officer for Free Expression at PEN America, and Ms. Christine Mehta, the Senior Editor at Harvard Public Health Magazine and the lead researcher on PEN America's latest report on hate in the headlines. Christine, before going to the break, you were talking about all of the findings and the results of this very important and timely report, Hate in the Headlines. And I just want you to give our listeners and viewers maybe some kind of futuristic outlook, right? What can we possibly expect? What could be some of the threats and challenges, that we can expect to be, ahead of us in 2023 and beyond when it comes to freedom of the press and freedom of expression more broadly?
Well, I'll bring it back to the United States specifically. So it was very tempting, I think, right when the midterms were over and only 14 election deniers were elected out of a potential 141 originally across all the different states in the US. So it's very tempting to say voters rejected extremism, voters rejected election denialism, voters rejected anti-democratic forces. That is a very encouraging step. But we do, as I mentioned earlier, always need to go back to the fact that extremist forces in the United States have been with us for a very long time, decades, and they will continue to be with us for a very long time. And unfortunately, the Republican Party and the Republican Party and the conservative movement specifically has provided a platform and an entree for right-wing extremism and anti-democratic sentiment to make its way as a major part, a significant portion of our mainstream political platforms. So this is something that journalists in particular, when they're safeguarding freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom, just democracy in general, this is something that any journalist and media landscape in a democracy that is experiencing backsliding, that is experiencing a rise of autocratic control of information, is going to have to remain very vigilant of. So to a certain extent, we're looking at things like in the US, keep track of state legislature, particularly. There's still 400 different state proposals to erode election integrity. Partner with civil society organizations and activists that have been covering these issues for a long time. Be less skeptical of them, which is something that I found to be quite prevalent amongst newsrooms in the name of, remaining unbiased, which is a very important journalistic objective. But we do need to understand who are all of our credible sources and which ones are important for us to include in our reporting. And then we, in particular, need to keep track of, again, where is this reporting going? Who is actually able to consume this reporting? And how can we connect the most important reporting that we're doing to inform the public of the health of democracy and what they need to know to safeguard democracy and make sure that it reaches as many people as possible?
Absolutely. And I think many of these threats are not going anywhere anytime soon. I mean, we're talking about disinformation, misinformation, hate speech, conspiracy theories, using social media and new media to spread all of that. We just talked about, the fact that we still have election deniers, those who believe that the past election was actually, stolen, it was completely, fraud, it was not true, it was not real. And we have those who are still not seeing what happened on January 6th as an insurrection. They think it was like people expressing their views, and that's the right to do so. So I think we have so many concerns.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think they're quite warranted. So I think we should take heart from the fact that voters are capable of rejecting anti-democratic forces, but at the same time, understand that those forces don't go away. They just shift their tactics and reemerge in another way. So that's something that journalists across beats in the newsrooms will need to become more aware of, more educated on, and media outlets and newsrooms need to continue to focus on this issue and allocate resources to training, and in particular also to safety and training for their journalists who are focusing on some of these issues.
Yes, absolutely. And I think your own report, Hate in the Headlines, is definitely a right step in the right direction, right? Trying to provide some of these, red flags and some of these alarming points and saying, be careful. We have all of this, strong wave, and we have to be standing together in solidarity against it. Just like we're talking about the future as well, Summer, if we can look at some of the future projects, maybe for PEN America, what do you have on your plate moving forward in the future? What are your next steps or next projects?
Sure. So there's many things I could talk about, but I will focus just a little bit on sort of what we're doing around disinformation right now, and specifically what we're doing in relation to journalists and newsrooms, because I think it really connects to what we've just been talking about. So our work kind of to counter disinformation in the coming 2 years in the next election cycle is going to be focused in some degree on community engagement. So we are very focused on working with those figures within communities who can be sources of credible information and sources of resilience against its disinformation for their communities. This could be, local journalists, could be faith leaders, librarians, educators, local community activists and organizers, folks who are trusted and who could use additional support and training to be equipped to support their community's resilience against disinformation. So we're doing some of that work in places like Texas, Florida, and Arizona in particular, as places where we see particularly a lot of communities of color very deliberately targeted with disinformation, often to dissuade people from voting or limit civic engagement generally, or to encourage them to vote a certain way, but really trying to take a sort of empowering approach to ensuring that the public has the information they need to make assessments about information, credible assessments about information, and avoid being the targets of disinformation campaigns. The other area of work is really working with journalists and newsrooms to help them counter the effects of disinformation and to help them gain the skills and knowledge that they need to be better able to counter it in their work as well. So we did a big survey last year as well that looked at the impact of disinformation on journalists and how it was changing their work, new burdens it's creating, again, new threats it's bringing, and the ways that the newsrooms are in many ways struggling to really respond in a systematic and holistic way, often because of, again, economic challenges, any number of stresses that they're already under. But disinformation is having a real impact on the practice of journalism across the US. And so we are going to be working on resources, on partnerships with newsrooms and trainings for journalists to really support them in this next election cycle in particular, to be better equipped to know how to fight back.
Absolutely. And we all need to have the right, strategies and tactics and information in order to fight back. And I hope that one of PEN America's maybe future projects is going to tackle this issue of social media regulation. What can be done, if any, to tackle this issue of, how can we put in place certain boundaries or certain mechanisms or certain tactics to try to maximize the benefits of social media and new media and disinformation revolution and minimize some of its harmful effects. Do you think maybe that's something that can be on the list of things to do for PEN America moving forward?
Yes, it's definitely on our minds as well. And I'd be happy to have somebody else come back on and talk about that in more detail at some point too. It would be great.
Absolutely. I'm very tempted to continue this discussion for another hour, but I'm afraid we're coming close to the end of our program. So I would like to thank you both so much for all the insight and useful information and knowledge that you both shared with our listeners and viewers today. And I wish PEN America all the best of luck moving forward. Thank you both so much.
Thank you so much for having us, Sahar.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. And thanks so much to all our listeners and viewers everywhere. And we wish you a happy new year full of joy, happiness, and health. Take care and goodbye.